For 3,000 years, one civilization stood as the undisputed economic titan of the ancient world. While other nations rose and fell on the whims of conquest, Egypt stood firm on a foundation of silt and water. But wealth in the land of the pharaohs was never just about gold. It was about the mastery of nature, the precision of bureaucracy, and a spiritual contract between a king and his people. Today, we peel back the layers of history to ask, how did a desert kingdom become the world's first superpower? How did they manage a fortune that built the wonders of the world? And ultimately, what happens when the gears of a perfect machine begin to grind against the friction of greed, climate change, and administrative decay? This is the story of how ancient Egypt managed and mismanaged its wealth. To understand Egyptian wealth, you must first understand the Hapi, the god of the Nile. Egypt was not a country of rain, it was a country of a single river. Every year between June and September, the Nile would swell, overtopping its banks and depositing a thick, nutrient-rich layer of black silt. This wasn't just dirt, this was the currency of the kingdom. The Egyptians viewed the Nile's flood as a literal delivery of wealth from the gods. If the flood was too low, the fields stayed dry and the economy contracted. If it was too high, it destroyed the very infrastructure, the dikes and canals needed to manage it. The entire Egyptian state was essentially an insurance policy against the variability of this river. The management of this wealth began with measurement. The Nilometer was the ancient equivalent of a stock market ticker. Scribes would watch the water rise. Based on these measurements, the government could predict the harvest months in advance. If the water reached 16 cubits, it was a perfect year. Taxes were set high. If it reached only 12 cubits, the interest rate of the land dropped. The state would lower taxes and prepare the emergency granaries. This was the world's first planned economy. Wealth management in Egypt was a feat of record-keeping. They functioned for over 2,500 years without a single coin in circulation. There were no banks, no paper money, and no silver coins until the very end of their history. Instead, they used a system of barter and units of value. The most common unit was the deben, a piece of copper weighing about 90 grams. A sandals maker didn't give a customer a 5-deben coin. Instead, the sandals were valued at 5 debens. The customer might pay with 2 jars of beer and a sack of grain that also totaled 5 debens in value. But who ensured the trade was fair? The scribes. The scribes were the accountants of the ancient world. They were the 1% of Egyptian society, the literate elite who tracked every cow, every bushel of wheat, and every man-hour of labor. Expert interview. A scribe was more than a secretary. He was a tax collector, a census taker, and a logistics manager. In the Old Kingdom, the cattle count was a national event. The king himself would often travel the country to witness the audit of the nation's livestock. Wealth wasn't hidden in offshore accounts. It was grazing in the fields where everyone could see it. Taxation was the engine of the pharaoh's power, but it didn't just come in the form of grain. It came in the form of corvée labor. In ancient Egypt, every citizen owed the state a debt of work. During the Akhet, the season of the flood, farmers couldn't work their fields because the fields were underwater. The state saw this as an untapped resource, millions of idle man-hours. Instead of letting the population sit idle, the pharaoh hired them. This wasn't slavery, as popular Hollywood myths suggest. This was a labor tax. In exchange for their work on pyramids, temples, and canals, the state provided food, clothing, and housing. Recent excavations at the workers' village in Giza have revealed a startling truth about how Egypt managed this human wealth. These weren't starving slaves. They were fed prime cuts of beef, fresh bread, and high-quality beer. By managing the surplus grain in the state granaries, the pharaoh could mobilize a workforce of 100,000 men. The pyramids were not just tombs, they were massive public works projects designed to redistribute wealth and unify a young nation. At the top of this economic pyramid stood the pharaoh. In theory, he owned everything. Every blade of grass, every drop of the Nile, and every human being belonged to the good God. This meant the pharaoh held a monopoly on foreign trade. Egypt was rich in grain and gold, but poor in wood and silver. To get the cedar wood needed for ships and the silver needed for jewelry, the pharaoh sent royal expeditions to Lebanon and the Sinai. Trade was left to private merchants. It was a state-controlled enterprise. The pharaoh's overseer of the treasury managed the flow of luxury goods into the palace. These goods were then redistributed to loyal nobles and priests, ensuring their continued loyalty. Wealth was the glue that held the political structure together. But, as we will see, what the pharaoh gives, the pharaoh can also lose. For centuries, this system was a marvel of efficiency, but the seeds of mismanagement were planted early. As the bureaucracy grew, so did the cost of maintaining it, and as the pharaohs gave more and more land to the temples to buy the favor of the gods, they began to lose control of the very wealth that made them divine.
The Old Kingdom is often remembered for the monumental success of the Giza Plateau, but the very stones of the pyramids tell a story of diminishing returns. As we move from the 4th dynasty to the 6th, the pyramids get smaller, the materials cheaper, and the craftsmanship more hurried. The Egyptian economy was facing its first great systemic crisis, the paradox of the eternal endowment. When a pharaoh built a pyramid, he didn't just build a tomb, he established a corporation. To ensure his soul was fed for eternity, he would endow the pyramid's mortuary temple with thousands of acres of the most fertile land in Egypt. This land was now tax-exempt. The crops grown on these estates didn't go to the national treasury to feed the army or build infrastructure. They went to the priests who performed the daily rituals for the dead king. By the end of the Old Kingdom, a massive percentage of Egypt's GDP was locked away in these eternal trusts. Generation after generation of kings added more exempt land. Eventually, the reigning pharaoh owned less of his own country than the ghosts of his ancestors and the powerful priests who managed their cults. This was the first major mismanagement of wealth. The Egyptian state was cannibalizing its own tax base to fund the afterlife. The central government became land poor, while the regional governors, known as nomarchs, grew increasingly wealthy and independent. Around 2181 BCE, the perfect machine broke. It wasn't just bad management, it was a climate catastrophe. Historical records and core samples from the Nile Delta suggest a series of low floods, years where the Nile barely rose at all. Without the flood, there was no silt. Without silt, there was no grain. In a well-managed system, the state granaries would have opened to feed the people. But the central treasury was empty, exhausted by the costs of pyramid building and the tax exemptions of the temples. The social contract was shattered. The pharaoh, whose primary job was to ensure ma'at, universal order and prosperity, had failed. Lo, the desert is throughout the land, the river is blood, men shrink from tasting it, the storehouse is bare, the king is stripped of his wealth by the poor. He who was a multimillionaire is now a man of no account. This period, known as the First Intermediate Period, was a dark age of civil war and famine. It serves as a stark historical lesson. Even the wealthiest nation on earth can collapse if its assets are illiquid and its central authority loses control of its resources. Egypt did not stay down. After a century of chaos, a new line of pharaohs from the south reunited the land, but they had learned a bitter lesson about wealth management. The kings of the Middle Kingdom, particularly Senusret III and Amenemhat III, were the great engineers of the economy. Instead of pouring all their wealth into massive stone mountains, they invested in capital infrastructure. Their crowning achievement was the reclamation of the Fayum oasis. They built a massive system of dams and canals to divert the Nile's overflow into Lake Moeris. This turned a swamp into the breadbasket of the world, adding thousands of acres of new, taxable farmland to the kingdom. This was a shift from monumental spending to productive spending. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs realized that a bigger tax base was better than a bigger tomb. They also began to professionalize the middle class. We see the rise of independent artisans, merchants, and a more robust regional economy. But agriculture was only half the story. To truly dominate the ancient world, Egypt needed a hard currency for international trade, and they found it in the south, Nubia. The very name Nubia may come from the Egyptian word nub, meaning gold. The Egyptians didn't just trade for gold, they colonized it. They built a string of massive fortresses along the Nile to protect the gold routes. Thousands of workers were sent into the blistering eastern desert to mine quartz veins. This gold didn't just sit in the treasury, it was the soft power of the pharaoh. Egypt became the Fort Knox of the Bronze Age. Foreign kings from Babylon and the Hittite Empire would write desperate letters to the pharaoh, literally begging for gold. "To my brother, the king of Egypt, send me gold. In your land, gold is as common as the dust on the ground." By managing the supply of gold, Egypt controlled the international exchange rates of the ancient world. They were no longer just a river kingdom, they were a global financial hub. But as the new kingdom approached, this massive wealth would attract the eyes of those who wanted to take it for force. The new kingdom would be Egypt's most prosperous era, an age of empire, conquest, and unimaginable luxury. But it would also be the era where mismanagement of wealth reached its decadent peak.
The New Kingdom was the superpower era. After expelling the foreign Hyksos invaders, the pharaohs realized that the best way to protect Egypt's wealth was to expand its borders. This was the birth of the military-industrial complex of the ancient world. Wealth was no longer just grown in the silt of the Nile, it was harvested from the battlefields of the Near East and the gold mines of the Deep South. Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of Egypt, conducted 17 military campaigns in 20 years. But these weren't just missions of glory, they were hostile takeovers. Every city-state that fell to the Egyptian chariot corps was required to pay an annual tribute. The New Kingdom economy was fueled by plunder and protection money. Thousands of cattle, tons of cedar wood, chariot wheels, and exotic oils flowed into the treasury at Thebes. For the first time, Egypt had a massive influx of foreign direct investment, not in the form of capital, but in the form of slaves and raw materials. This influx of wealth created a new social class, the professional soldier. The state managed this by granting land to veterans. This kept the army loyal and ensured the conquered wealth was redistributed, at least among the elite. But where did all this tribute go? Much of it didn't stay with the pharaoh. The Amun-Ra had become the patron of the empire. In gratitude for his victories, the pharaohs gave a staggering percentage of their war booty to the Temple of Amun at Karnak. By the reign of Ramses III, the Temple of Amun was the largest landowner in Egypt. It owned 90,000 people, slaves and laborers, 500,000 head of cattle, 400 orchards, and 50 shipyards, over 10% of all the cultivatable land in Egypt. The Temple of Amun was no longer just a place of worship, it was a central bank. It had its own granaries, its own fleet, and its own private police force. This was a classic case of institutional mismanagement. The pharaohs had created a state within a state. By funneling wealth into the temples to buy divine legitimacy, they were effectively bankrupting the secular government. Then came the heretic king, Akhenaten. History remembers him for his religious revolution, replacing the many gods with the single sun disk, the Aten. But follow the money and you see a different story.
Akhenaten's move to a new capital, Amarna, was a massive economic seizure. By closing the traditional temples, he froze the assets of the Amun priesthood. He redirected the massive flow of grain and gold away from the priests and directly into his own hands. Akhenaten was trying to break the Amun bank. He was attempting to re-centralize the economy under the crown. It was a bold, perhaps desperate attempt to fix the mismanagement of his ancestors, but it was a disaster. He abandoned the military outposts, and the tribute economy began to dry up. When Akhenaten died, the empire was in shambles. The empire was shrinking, and the people believed the gods had cursed the land. His successor, the young Tutankhamun, was forced to reopen the old temples and give back the wealth with interest. The Amun Bank had won. The mismanagement reached a breaking point under Ramses III. Despite his military victories, the bureaucracy was failing, corruption was rampant. In the 29th year of his reign, something unprecedented happened. The elite artisans building the pharaoh's tomb didn't receive their grain rations. The direct deposit of the ancient world had failed. "We have come here out of hunger and thirst. There is no clothing, no oil, no fish, no vegetables. Write to the pharaoh, our good lord, and write to the vizier that they may give us our provisions." This was the first recorded labor strike in history. The wealth was there, the temple granaries were full, but the administrative pipes were clogged with corruption. The governors were skimming the grain, and the workers were starving. It was a sign that the great machine of Egypt was finally starting to rust. As the new kingdom waned, Egypt faced a new challenge. The world was changing. The Iron Age was beginning, and a new invention was about to revolutionize the way wealth was managed: coinage.
By 1000 BCE, the Golden Age was a memory. The New Kingdom had collapsed into the Third Intermediate Period. Egypt was no longer a single, unified block of wealth. It was a fractured puzzle. The high priests of Amun ruled the south like a corporate theocracy, while the pharaohs in the north struggled to maintain a shadow of their former glory. But the greatest threat to Egyptian wealth wasn't just internal division. It was a global economic revolution that Egypt was fundamentally unprepared for. For millennia, Egypt's wealth was based on grain. It was a soft commodity. You can eat it, but you can't store it forever. The rest of the world, however, was moving toward hard currency. The Phoenicians and Greeks were beginning to use silver bullion, and eventually the first coins were struck in Lydia. Egypt, with its massive bureaucracy built on bartering sacks of wheat, found itself in a currency trap. Egypt was like a giant company still using a ledger system, while the rest of the world had moved to digital banking. Their internal prices remained stable because of the Nile, but their international purchasing power began to plummet. They had plenty of food, but they lacked the liquid capital to buy the new technology of the era: iron. To defend themselves against the rising empires of Assyria and Persia, the later pharaohs of the 26th dynasty made a fateful decision. They hired foreign mercenaries, mostly Greeks. These soldiers didn't want to be paid in grain or land. They wanted silver. This created a massive capital outflow. To pay these mercenaries, the pharaohs had to sell Egypt's grain surplus to Greek merchants in exchange for silver. For the first time, the bread of the Nile was being exported not for luxury goods, but simply to keep the army from deserting. The Egyptian management model was shifting from self-sustaining to extraction-based. In 525 BCE, the inevitable happened. The Persian Empire, the first truly global superpower, conquered Egypt. Under the Persians, Egypt's wealth management underwent its most brutal transformation. The Persians weren't interested in the pharaoh's divinity. They were interested in his annual yield. Egypt became Satrapy 6.
The Persians imposed a fixed annual tribute of 700 talents of silver, roughly 20 tons, along with a massive quota of grain to feed the Persian armies. This was the first time in history that the wealth of the Nile was being systematically drained out of the country to fund a foreign capital. The central bank of the Nile was now a branch office for an emperor in Iran. When Alexander the Great liberated Egypt from the Persians in 332 BCE, he did more than just found a city. He integrated Egypt into the Greek world. His successors, the Ptolemies, were the ultimate accountant kings. They took the ancient Egyptian bureaucracy and gave it a Greek makeover. They turned Egypt into a massive state-run plantation designed for maximum efficiency. The Ptolemies introduced state monopolies. The government owned the rights to all oil, salt, and papyrus production. If you wanted to press oil from seeds, you had to buy a license from the king. Banking systems. They established the first widespread banking network in Egypt, moving the economy away from the dirham and fully into the drachma. Tax farming. They auctioned off the right to collect taxes to wealthy individuals, ensuring the king got his money up front, while the tax collectors squeezed the peasants for every last drop. The Ptolemies were brilliant managers, but they were also predators. They didn't view themselves as pharaohs in the spiritual sense. They viewed themselves as the CEOs of Egypt, Inc. They maximized wealth, but they destroyed the social safety net that had existed for 2,000 years. By the time of Cleopatra, the mismanagement of wealth had taken a final, lethal turn. Sovereign debt. To stay in power, the later Ptolemies had borrowed massive sums of money from Roman bankers and politicians. They used this money to bribe Roman senators and pay for civil wars. Egypt was the richest country in the Mediterranean, yet its government was essentially bankrupt, underwater to Rome. Cleopatra's famous extravagance, the pearl dissolved in vinegar, the golden banquets, wasn't just decadence. It was a desperate display of financial strength to convince Rome that Egypt was still a viable partner. But when the Roman general Octavian defeated Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, the management of Egypt ended. Egypt wasn't just a province, it became the personal property of the Roman emperor. The story of ancient Egyptian wealth is a cycle of brilliant innovation and eventual decay. From the world's first planned economy to the world's most efficient tax extraction machine.
With the death of Cleopatra in 30 BCE, the management of Egyptian wealth changed forever. It was no longer managed for the glory of a resident god-king, nor for the maintenance of a local temple. Egypt became the private estate of the Roman emperor. While other provinces were governed by the Roman Senate, Egypt was so vital and its wealth so concentrated that the Emperor Augustus forbade any senator from even visiting the land without his express permission. To control the Nile was to control the lifeblood of the Roman Empire. Rome's management of Egypt was a masterpiece of extractive efficiency. The annona, the grain dole that fed the city of Rome, depended entirely on the Egyptian harvest. Every year, Egypt exported roughly 135,000 tons of grain to Rome. This wasn't a trade deal, it was a tax. The Romans kept the ancient Egyptian bureaucratic machinery, but stripped away its soul. They kept the Nilometers, the irrigation dikes, and the village scribes, but the surplus wealth that once built the pyramids or the temples of Luxor was now redirected to feed the idle masses of Rome and fund the legions on the German frontier. The Roman period was the ultimate mismanagement from an Egyptian perspective, but a triumph from a Roman one. They pushed the land to its absolute limit. They introduced new crops and better irrigation techniques, not to improve the lives of the Egyptians, but to ensure the grain ships never sailed empty. It was a colonial economy in its purest form.
Under the Pharaohs, despite the heavy taxes, there was a concept of mot, balance and justice. In years of famine, the pharaoh was expected to open the granaries. Under Roman management, that safety net vanished. The Romans implemented a poll tax, a tax simply for the privilege of existing. For the first time, Egyptians were taxed not on what they produced, but on their very lives. This led to a phenomenon called anachoresis, where farmers, unable to pay their debts, simply abandoned their land and fled into the desert to become outlaws. The mismanagement of the human resource, the Egyptian people, began to erode the foundation of the economy. By the 3rd century CE, the Nile Delta, once the most fertile place on earth, began to see its first signs of desertification due to over-farming and the neglect of the canal systems that the pharaohs had meticulously maintained for millennia. The story of Egypt's wealth didn't end with the fall of Rome or the Arab conquest. It simply transformed into a different kind of currency, historical capital. Today, the mismanagement of the past has become the management of the future. The wasteful spending of the Old Kingdom pharaohs on their tombs created a tourism industry that provides billions of dollars to the modern Egyptian economy. The mismanaged gold that was buried in the sand 3,000 years ago is now the engine of a multi-billion-dollar global industry. We might ask, was it truly mismanagement to build a pyramid that would stand for 4,500 years? Or was it the ultimate long-term investment? As we look back at 3,000 years of economic history, the lessons of ancient Egypt are startlingly modern. No matter how complex your banking system or your bartering system, wealth begins with the environment. When the Nile failed, the system failed. The bureaucracy trap, a system that exists only to sustain itself, like the late temple economies, will eventually bankrupt the nation. Liquidity matters. Egypt was rich in grain, but poor in hard currency when the world changed. Failure to adapt to global financial shifts led to their loss of sovereignty. Egypt taught us that wealth isn't just what you have, it's how you move it. They moved it with brilliant precision for centuries, and when they stopped moving it, when it got stuck in temples or frozen in debt, the civilization ended. Ancient Egypt managed its wealth with a vision that spanned eternity. They viewed their economy not in quarterly reports, but in dynasties and eras. They built a system so robust it survived foreign invasions, climate shifts, and religious revolutions. In the end, their greatest mismanagement was perhaps an excess of faith, faith that the Nile would always rise, and faith that the order of the past would always secure the future. But as the sun sets over the pyramids, we are reminded that while empires crumble and currencies change, the river remains. And the wealth of Egypt, the true wealth, was never the gold in the tombs. It was the knowledge, the organization, and the spirit of a people who looked at a desert and saw a garden.